Everybody in the back, there's plenty of seats in the front, and Mr. Schulman can maybe pull out some more chairs if we need to, or as well if we need more. But welcome. This is a co-sponsored event between Pilgrim Lutheran Church and Pacifica Christian High School, and we are so thrilled to be doing this together. In fact, there's really probably four institutions that are vital to this night. One is Pilgrim Lutheran Church, another one is Pacifica Christian High School, Santa Monica, a third is Pacifica Christian High School, Orange County, and a fourth is In Cristo at Veritas Foundation with Dick and Florence Reeson over here, who have been instrumental in this school for 23 years. So there's a lot of connections here tonight. There's board members. I'll introduce Keith Carlson, the board president of Pacifica Orange County. Dick and Florence, Keith, raise your hand for a second so we can see you. Dick and Florence Reeson right behind there as well. And then we'll get into Pilgrim Lutheran in a second. So thank you guys for being here. When Pastor Nunes came here to Pilgrim Lutheran, Pastor Nunes, raise your hand so everyone can see who you are. We had a really, really good relationship with Pilgrim. We have now an incredible relationship with Pilgrim Lutheran Church. And our stated goal together is to make 18th and Wilshire Boulevard the hub of Santa Monica, a light to the community. And so that's part of what tonight's about is being together in community. And just the fact that we're having this kind of conversation in this community is important because they're not having this kind of conversation at other corners in West Los Angeles. They're having vastly different conversations in those areas. So really excited. We're also excited to be partnering with the Center for Religion, Culture, and Democracy with Trey Dimsdale. And Trey's going to be speaking tonight a little bit. The Pacifica Center for Philosophy and Theology does a couple of different things. We put on events like this with Pilgrim. We also have articles that are written on our website for people to think about good ideas from different professors and thinkers from around the country. And we have a curriculum that kids go through, starting with Old and New Testament, right? Then they go into moral philosophy. And I was talking to a few students tonight, and I said, what is your favorite class this year? Mr. Robertson's moral philosophy class. It was really, really cool to hear them say that. Then they go into ancient philosophy. Then they go into late antique philosophy, studying Augustine's Confessions, right? Then they're taking political philosophy, finally modern philosophy, which we call atheism, basically. And they take patristic theology, which is the first 1,000 years of church history. So there's a lot of cool things going on. And what we're basically doing is we're looking at two strains of thought. One is the ancient strain of thought with the Jerusalem-Athens school that believed that truth exists, that it exists outside of us. It's not up to us. It's not relative. And then there's the Berlin-Paris school of the 19th and 20th centuries that believes that God is dead, and truth is a question mark, you know? And so those are the trains of thought we're tracing here. And we're tackling important questions like, is there a God? Is God good? Why do people suffer? What is love? Is there a relationship between faith and reason, science and religion? These are really important conversations to be having at Pacifica with students. This afternoon, we had what we called the Shaftesbury Seminar, where 12 students had an honor seminar. And they met with Dr. Dimsdale and Dr. Nunes for 4 hours, and the discussion around, is art and beauty subjective or objective? It was fascinating to talk about that concept. And the students pushed each other, they pushed the adults in the room, and we had this wonderful conversation about art and beauty. Does art and beauty exist before we were created? Those kind of conversations. It was really fun. In fact, a couple of years ago, a student called me back and said, Mr. Knight, I'm so glad I went to Pacifica. He was a freshman at Cal. And I said, well, tell me why you're excited. And he went to Pacifica. He was a Christian student. And he said, in my dorm room at Cal, there's two roommates. They're both atheists. And I'm a Christian. And I had read Marx and Nietzsche and Freud and these atheistic thinkers. And I had read Augustine and the church fathers and the Bible and knew who Jesus was. And they had not read any Christian works at all. They didn't know anything about Christianity. And they were embarrassed that he knew their side of the story and they did not know his side of the story. So they said, can you give us a list of Christian works that we could read to catch up to you? And he said, certainly. And he gave them the reading, and they read, and they had a wonderful conversation in their dorm room at Cal about God and faith and theology and life. And that's what this kid picked up at Pacifica. firmly rooted in who he was, but able to engage other people with different opinions in a culture that's not so hospitable to Christian faith. So I thought that was a huge win, and it was a great story and a great conversation. Thank you very much for that. This lecture series that we're doing is called Leisure at the Lyceum. The Lyceum takes its name from Aristotle's school in Athens in the 4th century, and it means basically to stroll, leisure, to have time to stroll. And when you have time, you get to reflect, right? And when you reflect, things begin to sink in. Dr. Reeson's written a book about this idea of leisure and learning, right? And you should pick it up, and you can talk to him about it. About the idea of when you have leisure time, you reflect, and reflection transforms who you are, right? So this night is about leisure, strolling. And in fact, Aristotle would stroll and talk about philosophy and mathematics and logic. And then they would have like wrestling and boxing and walking through the trees and nature and you know, all kinds of great things that come with leisure. And so tonight, this conversation is about trying to bring together what's being torn apart. Our society is more fractured than ever, but Christ and God tries to bring things together. And so that's what we're up to, trying to bring things together. And we're having important conversations. The theme of the year at Pacifica comes from Psalm 121, and it really is about looking up rather than looking in, looking up to God. It says, I look to the mountains. Where will my help come from? My help will come from the Lord who made heaven and earth. So we look up for guidance. We don't look in for truth. We look up to God for truth. And so that's kind of what we're doing. And so it's my pleasure now to introduce our keynote speaker, Mr. Trey Dimsdale. He'll come up and speak. Then we're going to have a panel after the speaking, and the panel will have question and answer with you. And so let me introduce Mr. Dimsdale. The talk title is Friedrich Nietzsche and the Decline of Christian Culture. And Mr. Dimsdale is the executive director of the Center for Religion, Culture, and Democracy. In this role, Mr. Dimsdale is responsible for establishing the priorities of the organization and leading a team of staff and affiliate scholars in the promotion of the center's mission. Previously, Mr. Dimsdale held director-level roles at several think tanks, most recently the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. He began his career working for a state trial and state appellate judge in the state of Missouri. He's also worked prior to law school and education and served as a private school administrator. We have that in common. This is nice. Mr. Dimsdale has presented at events and conferences in the United States and abroad. Speaking engagements have included presentations to the European Parliament, the Anglican Leadership Forum, European Economic Summit, and Congress of Christian Leaders in Nuremberg, Germany. He's published, including work, Theological Foundations and Practical Implications. His editorials and op-eds have appeared in the Public Discourse, the Washington Times, and Religion and Liberty Transatlantic. Currently, Mr. Dimsdale is admitted to practice law in the state of Texas. He is a member of the Philadelphia Society, the Federalist Society, the Ciceronian Society, and the American Political Science Association. He is also an associate fellow for the Center of Enterprise, Markets, and Ethics in Oxford, United Kingdom. Mr. Dimsdale both earned his law degree and undergraduate degree from the University of Missouri, Kansas City. He also holds a master's degree in theology and ethics. And it was a pleasure to have you today, lead our students through the Shaftesbury Seminar. So without any further ado, please welcome Mr. Trey Dimsdale.
It is really an honor to have been invited back to speak and to be able to spend time with your students today. I was here in January, and I don't remember if the event that we had was on a Friday or it was a Saturday. Either way, you're giving up a Friday evening to come and explore these really interesting ideas. And I couldn't be more grateful to be a part of it. The seminar that we held today with your students was really a very invigorating experience. At this point, I'm not even sure how many hours I've been awake, but it's only when I'm sitting down that I remember that I left Dallas, Texas this morning on the first flight out to make sure that I could get here for it. But it was well worth it. Every summer we do a program for elite college students that are looking into going into the humanities. This is a way that we're building a pipeline to try to help talented students who have an appreciation for the things that religion brings to public life to have a leg up and to be able to start their careers. The students that come through there, our goal is to try to coach them into having a publishable quality paper by the end of the fellowship, by the end of the summer. And after we've had 3 cohorts of students, we have had 5 or 6 that have had papers accepted to academic journals. We've had or to academic conferences. We have 2 that are actively working as journalists, one in Warsaw, Poland, and one in Miami, Florida. We have one who's an associate curator. She's not even 30 years old, and she's an associate curator at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. So we are accustomed to dealing with very talented students and trying to help them to move into positions of influence in this world. And this is actually the very first Shaftesbury seminar that we've done for high school students. This is something that we're exploring doing on a broader scale. So thank you, Mr. Knight, for allowing us to use Pacifica as a laboratory to sort of tweak the program and to begin engaging with a new demographic. So being a keynote ahead of a panel is really a much more interesting task than simply delivering a keynote. Because I don't have the pressure of presenting solutions. Those can come later. In fact, I have the freedom to even be a little bit more provocative than I might otherwise have been, because whatever questions you raise, you ultimately are the only person with a microphone that answers them when the Q&A starts. So hopefully I'll be raising some questions that our other panelists will be able to answer. And the primary focus when I had first conceived of this talk was to use Friedrich Nietzsche, who might be not so obvious choice for a thinker who might have something to tell us about Christianity and the role of Christianity in building culture. He's a noted enemy of the faith, in fact, a famous apostate. But we're going to look at a couple of interesting statistics. Now, I'm normally speaking to groups that are somewhere east of Dallas and south of Washington, D.C., and they find these stats shocking. You may not find them quite as shocking. The rest of the country is finally catching up with the experience that you have living here and attempting to live out your faith and to raise your family to appreciate the faith that they have inherited. But it's well documented that participation and practice of not just the Christian faith, but of religion in general, has been in pretty sharp decline in the last generation or more. There's a new book that came out just last year called Nonverts by Stephen Bullivant, who is a sociologist. He's a Catholic believer who teaches at St. Mary's University in the UK. It's really the second generation of works that are dealing with this phenomenon. There was an earlier book called The Nuns, and that term caught on, that means the religiously unaffiliated, by Ryan Burge, who's a political science professor in Illinois, where he just simply noted that there seems to be trends across every demographic, every way that you can slice up the American population, whether we're talking about Protestants or we're talking about Orthodox or we're talking about Catholics or we're talking about the upper middle class or the poor or African American communities or predominantly white congregations. There's been a decline in participation in religion in all of those communities. that seems to be pretty consistent across the board. You may have some groups that practice at higher rates than others, but when you compare those rates even to 10, 15, 20 years ago, they've dropped at about the same clip. Stephen Bullivant, in his book, notes that 49% of 18 to 29-year-olds in America, nearly half of 18 to 29-year-olds, believe that religion, and not necessarily just Christianity, but religion is a destructive force in society. It's not that they simply take a neutral perspective to it. They believe that as religious people and religious institutions and religious ideas are introduced into the public square, it actually has a corrosive effect on our society. These are people who are able to vote. These are people who are graduating from college. These are people that are graduating from professional school. We don't really have any stats for anybody below the age of 18, but these are young people who are maturing into leaders in our society, and almost half of them believe that religion is something that we should eradicate from the public square. The Pew Research Institute publishes fairly regularly all types of data with regard to many different aspects of public life, but specifically they publish pretty frequently data related to the practice of various faiths. In 1937, the very first time Pew released data, it showed that 73% of all Americans were members of a church, a synagogue, some type of house of worship. In 1999, now we're looking at 1937 to 1999, this is over the course of 60 years, the number dropped from 73% to 70%. It had stayed stable for 60 years. It had stayed stable, keep in mind, through World War II, the Vietnam War era, the Civil Rights era, the sexual revolution. It had remained stable. But in 2018, that number had dropped to 50%. And for the first time in American history in 2020, less than half of Americans, 47%, were members of some type of religious organization. Now, membership is dramatically different, right, Pastor Nunes, than actual participation. There's always a gap. There's always a gap between those who would identify as a part of a particular congregation and those who would give money or show up or participate in some sort of meaningful way. But nonetheless, at one point, 73% of Americans were members of some sort of a religious house of worship, and that number had stayed consistent through all kinds of calamity. And we know now that even post-pandemic, the numbers that are actually showing up at church even once a month have not rebounded, and it's sitting at about a third of Americans will attend some sort of a religious service every month. And so, I don't know, when I'm speaking in my hometown of Atlanta, Georgia, this is sort of shocking in the Bible Belt. Right. And when you compare these numbers to other parts of the world, especially in Europe, these numbers are still quite high. And there is a certain cultural influence that religious people still enjoy in the United States that they don't necessarily enjoy in other places. The city of Berlin, for example, has less than 5,000 people on any given week that are in any type of house of worship, whether it's Catholic or Lutheran or a Muslim house of worship or evangelical. Less than 5,000 people. This is all inside of a Western civilization that has its roots in ultimately a Christian civilization. Obviously that's a radical oversimplification, but the West has what French philosopher Pierre Manon refers to as a Christian mark. It may not be a Christian civilization. I mean, this is. I'm getting a little bit further. I'm getting away from my notes. I'll try to stick to them, but they have the Western civilization has the fingerprints of Christian influence. And so I'd like to think about not just Friedrich Nietzsche, but 3 different thinkers that would help us to understand what's at stake, why this decline may have occurred, and then one that might help us to see a way out. The first of these is Alexis de Tocqueville, who was a French aristocrat. He famously visited the United States in its earliest days, published in the 1830s, the 2-volume set Democracy in America. Was a judge, was a member of the constitutional, or the committee of persons who put together the French Constitution of 1848. That was the first French Constitution to guarantee universal male suffrage. And he wrote about America. Religion in America takes no direct part in the government of society, but it must be regarded as the foremost of the political institutions of that country, for it does not impact a state, it does not, if it does not in fact inspire freedom, it guides them in the use of it. Now, Tocqueville writes what the uses of religion are, how it is that Christianity in particular informed American society as he observed it when he was here. First of all, Christianity informs social mores. This is an important theme throughout Tocqueville's writings. It's sort of like almost a generic morality, we might say. It's not necessarily moral rules or moral ethical prescriptions that we might find directly from Scripture or from some sort of revealed text, but it's the general moral sentiment of the people. And so Christianity has provided that at the very earliest stages of America's founding. Christianity is also unique among religions in that it is forward-oriented. It provides a hopeful disposition. Irrespective of which tradition you may be a part of, we all are looking forward to the coming reign of Jesus Christ. And so we're not stuck in the moment. We're not stuck looking to the past. We all in some way are oriented towards the future. Now, there are some of us that are more oriented towards the future than others. But nonetheless, all of us at least give flip service, all Christians at least give flip service to being forward-oriented. And this was a unique advantage that Tocqueville recognized that America had. It was, in fact, he goes on a longer sort of discourse about how exactly it is that Christianity, for better or for worse, functions differently in America. Because America was brand new. You didn't have sort of an ethnic connection to a particular expression of the faith. And so Christianity was politicized in some sense, but not quite in the same way that you may have found it in Europe. But then also Christianity orients people. The third thing that he recognized is that Christianity orients people to the common good, some conception of the common good. Now, there are differences. There are clear differences between Christian traditions, but we all look to the same scripture. We all look to the same figures. We all look to the same basic set of authoritative sources for our understanding of the common good. Now, it's easy, I think, for us to get lost and distracted by the differences that might be between our various traditions. But keep in mind, there is less internal differentiation in Christianity than there is even in Judaism and even in Islam. So when you look at the kind of the extremes from the Serbian Orthodox to snake-handling Appalachian Christians, there's less distance there than there would be in whatever the equivalents are in the Muslim world. And so what's at stake, according to Tocqueville's analysis of the way that American society and American culture is shaped, are these things. As the prevalence of Christianity erodes, we end up with the underpinnings for our social mores, our common generic sort of ethical assumptions beginning to erode. And I think that we can even feel that inside of our own lifetimes. So Nietzsche is the Protestant. Tocqueville is a Catholic. Nietzsche is the Protestant that provides us some insight here. He happens to be also the only one on this list who's not actually a Christian. He's much more Lutheran than he is Christian. And he provides us with some insight as to the why. If we're looking at people who are leaving the faith or leaving the practice of the faith, it's probably pretty helpful for us to look at a person who reflected deeply about why he would leave the faith. And this is one. Nietzsche was baptized as a Lutheran. His father and his grandfather were Lutherans. His great-grandfather actually was a church organist that studied with Johann Sebastian Bach, and you don't get more Lutheran than that. And but he famously apostatized. He famously left the Christian faith and became a very, very vocal and vociferous critic of it. He's most famous for having said, or most famous popularly for having said, God is dead. And he said this he wrote this a couple of places in his writings, but the most, I think, useful place that he wrote this was in a book called The Gay Science, and he put this in the mouth of a character that he labeled the madman. So the madman runs through the market, and he's looking for God, and he's sort of being dismissed by all the people that are in the marketplace. And he ultimately says, God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. Now, he doesn't mean the concept of God. This is actually kind of like mid-20th century sort of interpretation of Nietzsche that sort of is probably trying to maybe not rehabilitate. It's a more sympathetic view that we probably need God to be dead. Because notice that second line, God is dead. He remains dead because he's not been resurrected. So you recognize the narrative that he's responding to. And he ultimately says that we have killed him. Now, it is true that humanity is the cause of Jesus' death, but he means this in a different way than merely that. There's a secondary meaning here. God is dead, God remains dead, because what he's responding to really is not, in all of his critiques of Christianity and religion, he's not really responding to the claims of Christianity. He's not really responding to the things that we would sort of think are at the heart of Christianity. Clearly, he's making reference to the resurrection here. But he really is responding to modernity as it has been wed to Christianity. So he is living in a time period, the mid to late 19th century. He dies in 1900. And this is at a time period where we are a couple of centuries removed from the dawn of the modern era. And a shift in the way that we understand the nature of reality and how we know what we know. The last time that I spoke at this, for one of your events, and oftentimes when I speak about this, I'll ask someone. I asked Pastor Nunes what his mother would be doing this evening. We won't repeat that. It was a disaster last time, right? But in any event, it might shock you for me to say, do you think your mother is? Well, we'll use my mother. I'm not sure what it's 9:30 in the Central Time Zone. My mother is in bed. But it would be shocking to me for someone to say, "Oh no, your mother is snorting cocaine off the back of a toilet in a gas station restaurant." That is a totally inconceivable idea. But I'm not with her. I cannot say with the type of certainty that modernity requires, because I am not perceiving it with my own senses, that that's not happening. And so what the shift of modernity has moved Christianity to a religion that is dependent upon experience. Now, oftentimes when we say that in the modern context, most people think we're talking about a critique of the person who is chasing an emotional high, who needs to have warm feelings, who needs to have lights and big drums, rather than the thoroughfares and the Eucharist. But Nietzsche is not responding in an age like that. He's not critiquing a Christianity that has become sort of a franchised McChurch type of Christianity. He's critiquing a Christianity that's still liturgical, that still gives lip service to sort of like being connected to the ancient faith. But he's critiquing one in which the experience, the personal experience, becomes the arbiter of what is true. And so Nietzsche just decides the claims that you make about who Jesus is, or who God is, the role that God has played in the establishment of the world, can't possibly be true because you do not live like it. You could not sit down in a conversation with Nietzsche and convince him to come back into Christianity simply because you can resolve all of the apparent contradictions in the Gospels. I guarantee you he could not possibly care less about that. You could not sit down with him and argue him back into the church on the basis of the moon being the right distance from the earth to keep the tides from drowning the people that live on the coast. It's the ethical dimension of Christianity and the way that we apprehend of who God is and who he would have us to be that actually caused him to become one of Christianity's most famous apostates. The Christian, the thinker who can help us find a way out, is one that we explored today with your students. He is Alexander Solzhenitsyn. So we have looked at a Catholic Christian, we have looked at a Protestant apostate, and now we will look at an Orthodox Christian. Solzhenitsyn is famous for having won the Nobel Prize for Literature. He is a Soviet dissident. He ultimately lived his final days in Russia, was able to return in the 1990s. One of the things that we explored with your students today was a famous lecture that he gave at Harvard University in 1978 called A World Split Apart. At this point, Nietzsche is celebrated. Solzhenitsyn is celebrated as a critic of the Soviet Union. So for those of you who were alive during the Cold War, you can remember a world in which there was a very clear dichotomy between good and evil. A very clear narrative of who's the bad guys and who's the good guys, who wears the black cowboy hat and who wears the white cowboy hat. And Solzhenitsyn had experienced the worst of the oppressive Soviet regime. And so he is, after he's won this Nobel Prize, after he's been exiled to the West, he's invited into the place that is sort of the quintessential symbol of the establishment to give a valedictory address. And in a world split apart, he then critiques the West. And he says to them, I would not recommend your country as a model for a free Russia. He says that the problem of, and this is interesting because he actually makes a shift where he both critiques the East and the West. I mean, it's he says that his people, himself included, have been refined and pushed into a spiritual depth through suffering and oppression that the West has not experienced. And the problem that he identifies is much like Nietzsche, the problem that Nietzsche identifies. Solzhenitsyn calls it anthropocentricity, this putting man on center stage, putting man right in the center of all that our society is about, and becoming to expect of ourselves and of our neighbors that we are completely autonomous, completely free of any type of authority over us. This is what he says his Soviet colleagues or comrades, I don't know if he would actually use that word, were expecting, and this is the way that the people in the West lived. And he writes this way out. If the world has not come to its end, which at this point is being sort of prophetic and apocalyptic, if the world has not come to its end, it has approached a major turn in history, equal in importance to the turn from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance. It will exact from us a spiritual upsurge. We shall have to rise to a new height of vision, to a new level of life where our physical nature will not be cursed as it is in the Middle Ages, but even more importantly, our spiritual being will not be trampled upon in this modern era. If man is both flesh and spirit, we have to have a recognition of the needs of both of these aspects of our humanity. Jesus himself was God incarnate, inhabited a body. We cannot adopt a Gnostic anthropology that the body is bad, is inherently evil or inherently sinful in some way, which is a lot different from a doctrine of original sin. But he's not laying out a program. He's not laying out, this is how you go about this spiritual upsurge. He's simply recognizing this is where the problem started, and this is whatever program you adopt, whatever project you adopt in the West, has to be geared toward combating this dominant anthropocentricity, that has come to dominate our societies. So, that is the close of my remarks, and I look forward to hearing what others have to say about these things.
That is quite a problem. 50% of people 18 to 29 think that faith should be eradicated. Thank you, Trey, for bringing us Tocqueville, Nietzsche, and Solzhenitsyn. And now we're going to hear from some of our panelists. And let me introduce them briefly for you. So first we have Mr. Alex Earl. Where is he? He's right here, Alex Earl. We've known each other for about 6 or 7 years. He's been a faculty member at Pacifica. He is currently the director of the Pacifica Center for Philosophy and Theology here at Pacifica, directing it from his work in Greenville, South Carolina. He received his master's in divinity from Yale University. He has also got his seminary degree from St. Vladimir's Orthodox in New York City, right? New York City. And so we're glad that Father Earl is with us. He has a daughter, Cordelia, and a wife, Danielle. So thank you, Alex, for being with us. The next panelist is Mr. Jeff Ennis. Jeff and I have been friends for 27 years. Jeff is a graduate of MIT. You see where I'm going with these credentials, right? Pretty smart folks up here. He's a founding board member at Pacifica. We started in 2003. Where's Jeff at? 2002 together. Jeff has 5 children and his wife Joanna, and we're just so pleased to have them here tonight. And also, I'll just briefly say, so the very first meeting in 2003, when we started talking about Pacifica, we opened in 2005, right? Joanna opened her home for this meeting to tell the community about Pacifica, and nobody showed up. It was just like the 5 of us, and here we are today. So thank you, Joanna. Thank you, Jeff, for doing that. And then we have Dr. Reverend John Nunes. He's got his PhD. He's a pastor, a national speaker all over the country. He's a very busy guy. Former president of Concordia College in New York City, former CEO of Lutheran World Relief, an Acton Institute fellow, senior fellow for the Center of Religion, Culture, and Democracy, and I'm just scratching the surface of what he's been doing and done for so many years. But most importantly, his wife, Monique, 6 kids, 12 grandchildren. So we could give that a hand, right? And then finally, Dr. Rachael Nyabadza, Associate Head of School for Academics at Pacifica, teacher, thinker, leader, mentor. She has her PhD from Yale University in Italian literature. And you have to get to know Dr. Nyabadza, her husband Godwin, and their daughter Rua. So thank you, Dr. Nyabadza, for being here as well. So I'll leave it to Father Earl to lead us here.
I'm going to move this just so we don't block any beautiful faces up here. Well, welcome everyone. I'm humbled to be up here with such brilliant minds. What we're going to do is I'm going to have each of our panelists basically give a response to Mr. Dimsdale, whatever they've cooked up listening to him. And we'll take a few minutes from each of them, and then we'll give a moment for Mr. Dimsdale to respond to them, and then we'll open the floor to discussion and Q&A on the floor. I'd like to begin with Dr. Nyabadza, if you wouldn't mind responding to Mr. Dimsdale's talk.
Absolutely. Oh, good. It's working. Hello, all. I don't know how many questions I have for you, but maybe they'll evolve as I'm speaking regarding my thoughts. Because what I understand is you're outlining these three thinkers and kind of their response to why there's a decline in religious affiliation today. And I think the thing that keeps coming to my mind, especially when you were talking about Solzhenitsyn, is this idea that our anthropocentricity, that's a long word, it makes a lot of sense if we look around at culture today. It's a desire for control, for man's control. And it brings me back to this idea of Cartesian metaphysics that I think Nietzsche is also responding to. Is I think, therefore I am, that our self, our selfhood, our existence is confined to our reason. And I think as Christians, there's a subversion of that. It's not I think, therefore I am. It's I am, therefore I think, that I am hidden in Christ. And there is empirical knowledge that is valuable, but there's another way to receive and understand the world around us beyond what empirical science offers us. And so that's just one thought that I had, because in order to embrace this idea of identity that, I don't know if transcends is the right word or precedes is the right word, but that challenges this idea that we're confined to our reason, it's a very humbling thing because we can't understand it rationally. And we can't quite feel it either. I'm not saying the answer is going to our feelings, but that's where the poetic language comes in, because poetry can touch on something that speaks to us somehow. So those are some of my first thoughts with that. And excuse me for my voice here. I am okay. I'm just recovering and taking a moment for processing my thoughts. So along with that, thinking about, that's what I was going to say. And also in the Christian concept, there's this idea of domination. And in the kingdom of heaven, there's no domination. There's hierarchy, but not domination. This idea of domination and control, that is of the kingdom of hell, let's say. And this idea of man being at the center speaks to this desire to dominate. Not just, I think, dominate the world around us, but our own selves. And in order, I think, to embrace this idea that our reality transcends our reason, it requires a humility and a submission to God. So I think that's a problem that I see in not just today, but in our history if we look back. I had another thought, but I think I'll get back to it. That's the essence.
Very good. Thank you. Mr. Jeff Ennis, would you like to respond?
Sure. So I was in agreement with your comments about Nietzsche being a product of the time period he was from. So not only the Cartesian metaphysics of Descartes, but you had the Immanuel Kant's project to build morality out of reason alone. Hegel, I think, preceded him. I don't know where Marx falls in, who was a young Hegelian. And then you have Nietzsche, who, the question I have, was he rejecting Christianity, or is he rejecting the version of Christianity that he received that had moved away from realism, influenced by nominalism, and because you contrast not just Solzhenitsyn, but the other Eastern thinker, Dostoevsky, was very much admired by Nietzsche, and had a similar diagnosis, if you will, but a very different reaction and interpretation. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that, and how much that might be tied to your comments on reality, which were the other thing, where I guess the other thinker that preceded him was Darwin, and this very materialistic turn that the world took, because you think it didn't necessarily have to go that way with a lot of these thinkers, where we rejected millennia of wisdom that came before, but it was rejected, and we kind of went away from the Socratics, embraced Democritus, material alone. So I'm just curious on your thoughts of how much Nietzsche was a product of his culture and that period of modernity, and hopefully we can get into some hopeful things on what the way forward might be.
Pastor Nunes.
Thank you. Trey, great talk, but it was exceeded by our time with the students today. The students were great, Mr. Knight. Thanks so much for the opportunity to spend time with them. The conversation was very engaging, and I'm very appreciative. So I'm wondering how much of this is like a first world problem. I'll just put it out there. So, the world in which Nietzsche lives, just oversimplified, has on the one side, and I know this because of my own Lutheran DNA. It's on the one side, you've got these people who are the kind of neo-Aristotelian orthodox people who believe that doctrine is the answer and the solution for everything, and there's this great German word, Lehrgerechtigkeit, right? Doctrinal righteousness. I'm made right with God because I have the right doctrine. On the one hand, and then as a reaction to that, you got the pietists who, say it's about feelings and activism. So again, I'm oversimplifying, which leads to this kind of nihilism in the West. But my question would be, there seems to be, there are more Christians in the world alive now than there have ever been in the history of the world. So and I've got some ideas about what can we learn from the church in the emerging world, and maybe, their growth is an indictment on the situation in which we find ourselves. And I've got more to say about that later, if I may.
Hope you were taking notes.
Yeah, so there's a couple of points to hit here. So Dostoevsky is the only Christian philosopher that Nietzsche respects. And there are some who say that this is because they're both philosophers of despair. Dostoevsky is living in the Russian Empire at the time. Russia is the last country in Europe to eliminate serfdom. They have serfs in Russia up into the 20th century. So Dostoevsky has a lot of reason to have despair, especially to the extent that he's kind of aware that the rest of the world is moving forward, and Russia seems to be kind of left behind. But I think that what's interesting about them is that they offer two different solutions, and Nietzsche's is to just dive headlong into meaninglessness, go ahead and create your own morality, because only the strong survive. Now, Dostoevsky Nietzsche has historically been misused. He had a sister that was his executor and controlled the publication of his works, and so his works were edited in such a way to make him look much more, to like an anti-Semite to support the Nazi cause. She died in the late 1930s, I think, and only fairly recently has his work been re-edited in such a way that it's a little bit more reflective of his thinking and not her agenda. It doesn't necessarily improve it that much, it just with regard to that one thing. So he dives headlong into this. Only the strong survive. They're the ones those are the ones that can dominate. The whole idea too, the larger context of him talking about God is dead and the madman yelling this and warning people. There's another place where this shows up, where it's a person that lives in the hills who comes down into the town and he thinks, well, I'm going to try to convince these people. I'm going to describe what Nietzsche calls the last man, which is like feckless, weak. He's only interested in security. And he thinks this person is going to be so revolting that all of these people are going to decide, well, I'm going to be the Übermensch. I'm not messing around with being the last man. And to his horror, the people decide, oh, they're alarmed. It doesn't really sound that bad. They are going to opt in for safety rather than kind of seizing, life by the horns and creating their own destiny. Dostoevsky goes the other direction, which I actually think these are the two directions that you see a lot today with the nuns. So you either have people who just get very dissatisfied with the vapidness of what is on offer in a lot of American Christianity, and they may not end up being as violently opposed to Christianity in the way that Nietzsche was, but clearly he didn't stop thinking or writing about religion. He was well catechized, and it was something that haunted him and he wrestled with for his life, for the rest of his life. But Dostoevsky goes the other direction. Now, it's not like he's coming out of a completely different tradition, but it's a response to despair and an invitation into sort of recognizing or conceding that life is meaningless. And Dostoevsky is another person who is oftentimes, especially in the present day, misused by some, because he writes about returning to soil. And so a lot of times this is used in Russian conservatism as being like blood and soil nationalism. But what he really means by that is to return to groundedness and locality and a sense of place, a place where the inheritance of your faith is instantiated in the community that has formed you and birthed you and turned you into an adult. And so the pathway that I think a lot of people travel, this has definitely been true of me, is you get to you sort of see the shortcomings of what American Christianity has to offer, and you opt into a historic, more liturgical apostolic tradition. I myself converted to Anglicanism, and that's a long story. Part of the reason I did it is that I'm an Anglo-American, and I believe that there is something to be said about the dialogue between a culture and a faith that represents it, and how they shape one another in both good and bad ways. I don't have a problem necessarily with Roman Catholicism or with Orthodoxy, but I'm not Serbian and I'm not Romanian. I'm not criticizing you because I'm assuming you're not either. But for me, that was a big part of that. And unfortunately, I think that the people that become the nuns that just sort of disappear, some of them become very angry. Some of them become, act out and become sort of new wave atheists. But then, I think there's some hopefulness in seeing young people, instead of being nuns, being unaffiliated, or rediscovering the historic Christian faith as it's been preserved in the apostolic traditions. Now, the question about the majority world is an interesting one, because I obviously don't speak as one who is from that world, but a majority of those who share my particular expression of the faith are. The average Anglican today is a 33-year-old Angolan woman. I don't know exactly how you arrive at that, but I'm not a demographer, but somehow you take all the various axes of diversity and you pile them on top of one another, and that's what you come up with. And I think that one of the things that's that they have an advantage over us is that other places in Solzhenitsyn's writings, he does not deny being postmodern, which we're sort of afraid of being. He recognizes that you're not going to get the toothpaste back in the tube, but he tries to figure out a way that you can be postmodern. Obviously, in that quote that I read, he's looking at returning back to something that's pre-Middle Ages. And so a lot of the worst that modernity has to offer simply has not made it to that part of the world, which is a blessing in disguise, because there's other things modernity has to offer, like modern medicine, that also haven't made it to that part of the world. But one of the things that you see there is, so for those of you who aren't Catholic or Anglican, I actually don't know if this is true in Orthodoxy, you can comment on this, I guess. The shepherd's staff that a bishop will carry, it's called a crozier, is a sign of authority. So if you are a bishop and you're not in your diocese, you can wear all of the vestments of a bishop, but you wouldn't normally carry a crozier. And you certainly wouldn't be an Anglican or Episcopal bishop and carry one in a Catholic church or vice versa. But African Christians have begun allowing cross-tradition carrying of croziers, which doesn't seem like it's really that dramatic, but it's quite dramatic given the seriousness with which they preserve their traditions. And I think what that is a function of is they look across their city or their, the rural area where they live, wherever it happens to be, and they have more in common with their Catholic or their Anglican or their Methodist or their evangelical brothers and sisters there than they do when they look at headquarters in Rome or in Canterbury. And I think that's something that ecumenism will ultimately save us, I think, but ecumenism in the most healthy way, where we look to see what is it these various traditions have actually figured out, and we can't afford to be dismissive of one another. When persecution comes, they're not going to be, asking you, oh no, you're a Lutheran pastor. We're going to let you by, but we're going to execute you in the street. You're both wearing, yeah, exactly. So that I think that I hit all the points. Was that it?
I want to give a second to, we're getting to something like solutions, because we were talking a little bit amongst ourselves where it's very easy, and if you're plugged in at all into anything, really, social media, whatever, everything is shock value, and everyone is diagnosing, and everyone is critiquing, because everyone says, what on earth is happening? That is the common feeling. Doesn't matter where you come from, what end of the political spectrum, what religious tradition. There is one thing shared among most people, and that is the feeling of what is happening. But then the question is, okay, we can talk all day long about what is happening, and there's about as many opinions as there are people, particularly in sort of mass media, democratic cultures. But we don't often talk about what solutions might look like, and we have some. So you've given us something like a flavor of your solution, which maybe involves something like this kind of ecumenism that we see in places like the African continent and other places. But I do want to open up the floor to you guys one more time to ask, do you agree with Mr. Dimsdale? What do you see as the solution, if there is one? Like, how can we move towards, particularly what the center is about, bringing together what is being torn apart? Doesn't matter the order. Whoever wants to go first.
I think, and maybe this speaks to more my expression of faith, but for me, the answer first lies in the individual, and then the family, and then perhaps the church. I think we need to make more space for contemplation, and we're busy doing things, but we don't spend a lot of time contemplating in silence and being still and knowing that God is God, and knowing our inadequacies to structure and build the life that we think we can build to fulfill our deepest desires. Because I think that goes back to the man-centric kind of universe, is this belief that we don't need God. God is dead. We can construct our own modernity without him. So I think it starts and kind of going back to what I said before, it starts with a posture of humility, but also creating the space in our lives to recognize that. And that in turn affects your own experience of others, family, your ability to have a family and engage in others in a certain way, and then your community and your church. Those are my instincts.
Is this on? So I would say the solution is a return to apostolic Christianity. I'll use that term. And what I mean by that is the vision of the cosmos that comes out of that period, the first 1,000 years of Christianity, where there was, the non-Chalcedonians aside, one church. So it's pre-schism, pre-Reformation. So in that, and I think that's what, in my view, Dostoevsky's tradition, being outside of modernity in serfdom Russia, still had in place, which was, an understanding of the cosmos as theophany, a manifestation of God. The transcendent and the material are one. I think that's what was largely lost with a lot of those thinkers I mentioned earlier. And I think Nietzsche was responding to that in many ways. And where I'm hopeful is that even with the materialists today, and many scientists, particularly physicists, are questioning the frameworks for which we understand reality, space-time being one of them, that really is just a headset, so to speak, that we're looking through. It's not reality itself, that it doesn't work at the very small scale. And so they're proving this within their own materialist system. And so that opens up, and you're seeing this in a lot of the neuroscientists and whatnot, and you have these conversations, they're engaging with philosophers, theologians, and in those conversations, people are talking about, non-human agency, other transcendent ideas, even mentioning demons and angels, and these very materialist, atheist people are like, yeah, they're just engaging all this stuff where even 5 years ago that would have been completely shut down. So, the era of the new atheists in that period and the aughts is we're well past that. So I think there are many hopeful signs, but there's a philosopher, David Bentley Hart, who wrote an essay I found fascinating for First Things called Christ and Nothing. And in that, he basically points out that Christianity helped contribute to the nihilism of today because it so thoroughly defeated the paganism and the fate-based society that came before it. It was the only thing to hold back that nihilism. And as it receded, the nihilism has come through. So the only way to get through this meaning crisis and the nihilism that goes with it is to return to that understanding of the cosmos. And the encouragement I have is I see that the roots of that, even amongst the materialist thinkers.
I agree with you, Jeff, entirely, that we live in a time of tragic hopefulness. The signs of tragedy are all around us. You well articulated them, Trey, in terms of this kind of post-American civil religious society in which we live. And that society is dead, and it's not coming back to life ever. So Christians in the West are going to have to accommodate ourselves to that. Okay, there's no return to whatever your time in history is that you use as a marker when churches behaved in a certain kind of way and Christians behaved in a certain way and civil society behaved in a certain Christian or Judeo-Christian way. That time's not coming back. And I think this is a great opportunity. We talk about this a lot, Jim, about being here at 18th and Wilshire, and that God has planted us and placed us here. Because to confess or profess Christ in 2023 means something. I think in previous generations, people could be inoculated by such small dosages of Christianity that it prevented them from catching the real thing. And that can't happen anymore. You have to make a stand for the faith now or not. And I think that's actually a great place for us to be. I had an opportunity to visit the largest Lutheran church in the world, which is in Ethiopia. It doesn't have the word Lutheran in it, which is like stunning and bending to people in the many North American Lutherans, but it's called Makane Jesus, which means the place of Jesus. That's what they call their church in the Amharic language. And the president there in 2009 was a man named Itefa Gobena, and I visited with him and asked him about their growth, because they were founded in 1959 with 65,000 members. 1959, 65,000 members. They now have over 10 million members, which is more Lutherans than there are Lutherans in North America, for example, okay? And they're a very young church. And what I found comforting was that when he described that church, there's nothing that they do that we don't know. So, for example, they said that they believe that every baptized believer is in ministry. Like, baptism isn't a ritual you get done. Baptism is the introduction into a faith community that puts you into the work of ministry. They said, second, they believe that they are in ministry to the whole person. So it's not just addressing the head or some tingling feeling that you get on Sunday mornings, but it's your whole life. So it encompasses everything that you are. Third, they said that they believed that they have been in revival. That's how they described it. Namely, the work of the Spirit is at work in their lives every single day. So we might call that baptismal remembrance every day, dying and rising with Christ. And the fourth one was the one that kind of shocked me and rocked me. He said, we are ready to die for the faith, and we have. And they have story after story about Marxist government, the Derg Marxist government, who had overtaken Ethiopia, and those who were ready to give their life for the faith. Now that, to me, sounds a lot like the early church. So this time in which we find ourselves is, you can call it a tragic time, but I believe it's the healthiest time we may have in the West ever in the history of Christianity, in the West anyway.
Would you like to close with a couple minutes, maybe, response, or anything you'd like to hop on some of that?
We can go ahead and do that.
Okay, very good. Let's go ahead and open the floor to some questions. Does anyone have any questions, particularly for Mr. Dimsdale? I'll play the game of bringing a microphone to you. Any hands?
So I have a question, I think, about, well, the first part of the panel was mostly about the relationship between the culture surrounding Nietzsche and Dostoevsky and Solzhenitsyn and how it affected them. And would you agree with the statement that Nietzsche and Dostoevsky, when facing the same problem, came to different conclusions because of the fact that in the West, in Nietzsche's time, we have Marx and all these other revolutionaries, that there's a sort of movement to uproot everything that was built and to build something new. While in the East, we do have that in places like St. Petersburg and Moscow, but most of the time when you go into the countryside, there's a lot more to be looked back on and to use as a source for tradition, especially with the Gregory of Alaska and Seraphim of Sarov, who were very big figures in the Russian faith community at that time. But due to the fact that the Western sort of, I don't want to say religion, but the Western sphere was so thoroughly uprooted from that with movements before, such as the French Revolution and the American Revolution, where things were started anew. Would you say that had a big effect on the conclusions that these two philosophers came to?
Is it on now? Okay. So, Dostoevsky's solution, part of it is this return to soil, this idea of a groundedness and a rootedness. And even at that point, when people were and communities were relatively immobile in the West, there was a loss of a sense of place. That's not, the Orthodox traditions have an advantage in that most of them are, all of them traditionally are ethnocentric. I mean, that's kind of a loaded term today. But you have the Romanian Orthodox Church, and you've got the Serbian Orthodox Church, and the concept of secularity enters into the West. It doesn't enter into the East. So, so you don't have you don't have sort of you don't have the development of a sacred secular divide quite in the same way. And another interesting thing that you note that had died away in the West, in any form of Christianity, is that it used to be that you wouldn't necessarily identify yourself based on the city you were from or the region. It was like a local holy man. For lack of a better word, I'm not talking about like a witch doctor. You would say you wouldn't say I'm from the north of England. You would say I'm from St. Cuthbert's Land. Because that gives like a figure to which you look that represents a very localized, particularized expression of the faith that is attainable for you because you're from the same place, you speak the same language, you read the person's writings and you recognize the geography that they describe. And that is missing, and that is missing in part because of complex factors in the West. But one of those things, as you mentioned, is this uprootedness, the destruction of tradition that Nietzsche represents, along with some of these other figures. I would absolutely agree with that.
Is that a hand?
I think following up on Pastor John's comment of the church of the past will be different today, essentially. I'm wondering, a friend once said every generation has to confront the revival of Gnosticism anew. It's the heresy that just won't die, all the great councils and the rest, and each generation comes up with its own version. Where we are in our particular place, it seems like it's a bit reversed in that the glorification of the physical in the secular world has become triumphant and less the spiritual. And yet, at the same time, if one asks the society, how's that going for you? Okay, we've legalized the drugs, we've ripped away all the sexual ethics, we've torn down all the barriers. How are we doing? How happy are we? How joyful are we? We've just kind of had a reverse form of this. I'm wondering how much the Gnostic heresy ties into this battle that I hear elements of from each of the panelists. And in terms of solution, does the society simply have to stare at their own unhappiness with divorcing the physical, the material, and the spiritual, in sundering it in ways that ought not to be sundered?
Well, I'll comment on that. I think I understand. My understanding of secularism I got from the late Father Alexander Schmemann, who describes it as the negation of worship. So the secularists are Christian heretics largely. They're basically operating within the broad Christian deposit. They're just reinterpreting these things. So I think that's why you see the rise of various forms of Gnosticism in every era. It's a heresy. All the heresies that we see today are not new. There's nothing new under the sun, right? So I think, in my view, the solution, again, I keep going back to apostolic Christianity, is a return to worship, really as an antidote to pride, the deadliest of the 7 deadly sins. So I agree you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. All societies are led by some form of an elite. But I think we need to return to an authentic worship to center ourselves properly in the cosmos and essentially everything kind of falls downstream from there.
Well, okay, I'll hand it to you. So this is pretty controversial, but there are, the discussion. There would argue. Sorry, there are those that would argue that is a form of Gnosticism. That's like our modern Gnosticism, but it's sort of a unique type of Gnosticism because it's a de-emphasis on the physical to the extent that it's inconsequential, because it's not really people who are embracing the same sort of, there's a spiritual and physical divide. It's more of like everything is sort of reduced to a byproduct of biology. So the emotions or the internal compass that would sort of direct you to discern your gender that might be different from biological indicators, traditional biological indicators, is not necessarily understood to be spiritual. It's still a function of biology, but all of this physical is denigrated to meaninglessness and nothingness. Now, another aspect of it that's similar to Gnosticism is this special knowledge that's available, that's indecipherable to those that are external from a person's own minds and feelings. And interestingly enough, the very best research that shows that shows how you sort of deal with that is going camping, returning to soil, placing yourself back in creation so that you have sort of a reorientation that you're a part of a created order, and not merely a face that's glued to a screen. I'll pass.
I'm so convinced about what I'm going to say that I might be absolutely wrong about this. One of the things we haven't mentioned is the affluence of Western society. It seems to me that the glaring difference, one of the huge differences between the spiritual temperature of the places we're talking about and our own, is that our income here is 3 or 4 or 10 times what it is in the places that we're sort of praising for Africa, we mentioned. It seems to me a glaring difference between the two things, and that's certainly not an unbiblical subject at all. Yeah.
A term I like is affluenza, in terms of what we suffer from as a culture. But to the previous speaker's point as well, I agree, the hauntedness by God, we have more opportunities to fill that hauntedness with all sorts of experiences and events and things in our life. And St. Augustine remains just as true now as he was then. You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our souls are restless until they find rest in you. And I think that's what you really mean by worship. It's that resting in God. But we've got so many distractions, to your point, to take us away from that rest, and so many opportunities to be distracted.
Yeah. The rest of the world can't imagine, and it's leagues ahead of everybody else.
Yeah, I think that's a symptom of modernity, and looking for meaning in the material, and chasing after wealth to find purpose. I think that, but if you look at the surveys of happiness, I think the Lutherans in Ethiopia would score much, much higher than the average American in the United States.
Other questions? Oh, there you go.
So this whole discussion is kind of about the decline of Christian faith and people exiting the faith or not coming back or not looking into it. I don't know the exact statistics, but I do know that there are more women currently in the faith right now, right? And so my question to one or any or all of you is, why do you think that might be? Why more men have left? Why they're not coming back?
So Nietzsche's helpful here, right? Because Now, yeah, I mean, he goes stark raving nuts on this, right? So he's, with his Ubermensch, right? But he's right about the feminization of Christianity. And I'll kind of stop right there, yeah. Too many people actually know my wife in this room, so I'm going to stop talking.
I think part of it too is that there's a boy crisis just in general. More men commit suicide. Fewer boys graduate from high school and go to college. Fewer men in college actually finish college. That's a very, very complex phenomenon. And because of a microphone, I can pretend like I know what I'm talking about, I guess, and just say I think that's probably a part of that entire problem, that men are in crisis in general. And I'm not sure if it's because they're not in church or they're not in church because church doesn't really offer anything to solve these problems. But nonetheless, I think it's a part of the same thing. There's a huge body of work that's written on that's very, very helpful, I think. Very, very helpful.
Thank you, guys. Seems like there's been secularism throughout history. Are there cycles that we go through in society becoming more secularized? And what can we learn from the past as to how Christianity has survived that? How has it adapted, if it has at all?
You're going to say monasticism.
I'm sorry?
You're going to say monasticism.
Yeah, well, so the secular...
Which is right.
Yeah, well, the secularism that I've referred to is really something that largely came out of the Enlightenment, that came out of that modernity and whatnot, that period that we're referring to that influenced Nietzsche. I think there was just, at least in the West, there was just broad Christendom before that. So that was at least from a understanding of the cosmos, the understanding of reality was that Christian worldview, and that's what began to be questioned, largely simplistically with Descartes and on through some of those other thinkers I mentioned earlier. And so I think, but we tend to, in the West, think of history since the Enlightenment. Now, everyone kind of it started with Descartes, so to speak. And so I think the solutions, at least, is going back to the wisdom that was before that, what I said earlier, where it didn't have to be that way. In other words, we have these new scientific discoveries, we know more about the cell, we know more about the universe. We could have kept that within that wealth of wisdom that came before it, but just the thinking that took place, we decided to deviate from it. So I think that, to me, is what we really need to return to. That's not putting the toothpaste back in the tube and saying we need to go back to this period in history and have all these things exactly the way they were. It's really just a return to the virtues and the what defined people and drove them in that era.
So there is no new wisdom. There's only ancient ancestral wisdom that we apply to new situations or new contexts. So the ancient wisdom, I'm reading a book right now by David Kreider, Kreider, and it's called The Patient Ferment of the Early Church. And it's transforming my view. They had no evangelism programs and yet grew at 40% every 10 years. And it was in part because of, according to this book, again, no surprises, catechesis, teaching the faith, and habitus, living the faith. And especially the virtues around, so there's no compulsion. We talked about this, Pastor Trevor. They shared their food, they loved one another, they didn't share their wives, they were virtuous, and their lives were attractive to those around them. And I think that's the call in a culture like we find ourselves. They willingly suffered for the things of God. So I'm kind of repeating myself now as well. And yet they were convinced that the mission of God was both unhurried and unstoppable. So they lived with that confidence in the culture. not beating up on the culture and banging against the culture and, criticizing the emperor, but living out their faith in community. Yeah.
A round of applause for our panel and Mr. Dimsdale. Before I invite our associate director up to close us out, I'd be remiss as the director if I didn't say something about just the beauty of this evening, the beauty of this afternoon, and what we're doing here at Pacifica and at the Center for Philosophy and Theology. That there are even so many of you sitting in here on a Friday night is mind-blowing. It is mind-blowing. And, we come up with all these mottos and so on. We're existing to bring together what's being torn apart. We've saved you a seat here. But one thing we're doing, I think this captures some of the solutions, is we're creating a culture. We're creating a culture here at Pacifica. We're creating a culture with our students. We're trying to create a culture with you, because we're not going to reach our students. This is why the center exists, if you're not involved in it. If you're not having that conversation at home, and if that conversation doesn't make you uncomfortable, frankly. And so one part of the solution, whatever you thought was set up here, is that you are here. And that this community is coming together, this community is having these conversations, and our kids are having these conversations. Everything mentioned today, I literally say almost everything mentioned today, happens in a classroom at Pacifica Christian High School. That's the kind of conversations 16, 17, 18-year-old kids are having. I guarantee they're not having them somewhere else. And so please continue to support Pacifica. Come to these events, but also support Pacifica with your words. Tell people what you experienced here today. Tell people what we are doing, and invite them to the table. Because I really believe this is one of my most exciting things in my life. Of course, I'm a priest. There's a lot of things that are exciting. But being part of this, it's incredible. I hope you feel that same sense of beauty. We talked a lot about beauty today. It's been a beautiful day. It's been a beautiful evening. And so with that, I'm going to invite our Associate Director, Stefan, to come and close us out.
Can you grab that podium for him? Stefan, come on up, Stefan, before he speaks. So I also want to thank Pilgrim Lutheran Church because it's not just happening at Pacifica, it's happening at Pilgrim, and it's happening at Pilgrim and Pacifica together. And I also want to highlight Dr. David Albertson. He's doing great work over at USC, and there's a lot of stuff going on at USC. In fact, they're hosting a conference, I think it's this week, right, coming up, as well, on Tolkien and mystery. So talk to Dr. David Albertson if you want to talk about Tolkien and mystery. They're also doing a program in January, I believe. So there's lots of other options. Pacific Orange County is doing a lot of things. We travel down there. They travel up here to have these conversations. So lots of cross-pollination. So with that said, Stefan Roberson is going to lead us out. But I will say one thing. Today, I'm going to take a liberty here, so sorry about that. At 2 p.m., Mr. Roberson was on a phone call defending his thesis, right? So, yeah. So not only did he teach all day, not only is he here tonight, but he was defending his thesis from 2 to 3. So at 2 to 3:30? Yeah. So at 3:30, I was setting up, and I'm like, where is this guy? I'm like setting up stuff, and he's supposed to be helping, and he's defending his thesis. So I asked him I go, Stefan, how did it go? He's like, yeah, he killed me. And it was over like one word, right? It was over one word. Actual, And so thank you for all that you're doing. Thank you for the ideas you present in class. These guys love it, right? Yeah, they're right there. These guys love it. So say something good to us.
All right. So as I'll read you my thesis now. No. Well, I just wanted to echo what Father Alex Earl just said. Thank you to all of you for coming out here tonight. There's many things that could take our time and attention on a Friday night. That new David Beckham documentary on Netflix, for example, okay? But I am so delighted that you chose to share tonight with us, to see the value in these ideas, because you know that ideas have consequences, as we've learned tonight, right? So thank you so much. Tonight we've delved into the depths of Nietzsche's ideas, along with other thinkers. And we've discussed profound questions about existence, about the decline of Christianity in the post-Christian West, and potential solutions to that problem. But this is just the beginning of the conversation, right? And so I want to encourage you, the night's not over, right? Philosophy is not a solitary pursuit. It is one that we do in community, in conversation with others. So I like to think that the ghost of Aristotle is walking through these halls of this Lyceum, and that tonight we also can participate with him in that conversation. So please stick around, engage in that conversation more. Maybe, who knows, the next enlightening idea or perspective may arise from a conversation right here tonight, whether it's over some San Pellegrino or over a glass of wine. So please stay. I also just want to thank our guest speaker, Trey Dimsdale. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your engaging talk and your thought-provoking questions to us.
You'll be at Pilgrim on Sunday at 9 o'clock.
Okay, so there's a shout out to come to Pilgrim at 9 o'clock on Sunday. And also I just want to thank our panelists. Thank you so much for your interaction with Trey Dimsdale. Lastly, I just want to remind you, and since you're here on a Friday night, I don't need to do this because you already know it, because you're here. But the quest of thinking and living well extends far beyond this event. Philosophy is not just an academic exercise, but it's a guide to a more meaningful and purposeful life. And for the Christian, philosophy is best expressed in Anselm's dictum, faith-seeking understanding. So let the questions that are raised tonight continue to inspire you. Let your faith grow as you seek out understanding, and let wisdom and virtue be a lifelong endeavor as you go from this event. Thank you once again for your presence, your curiosity, and your passion. Safe travels, engaging conversations, and a lifelong commitment to thinking and living well. Good night.
Yard for coffee and cookies and fellowship.